Hi everyone, this is Andrew Primer, Ukrainian American reporting from Kiev. In today's podcast, week 173 of Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is the last week of June 2025. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about NATO summit and its results, and will the US keep supporting Ukraine, and how long the Russian economy can sustain sanctions. For the Netherlands, this was the biggest security operation in its history. For NATO's 32 member states, the Hague summit was historic too. So NATO's Hague summit will be remembered for both what was done and what was not done. The commitment by NATO leaders to spend at least 5% of GDP each year on core defense needs, as well as defense and security related expenditure by 2035, will significantly increase the military capabilities of allies, particularly European ones. Fulfilling this commitment is crucial for implementing NATO's new regional defense plans to deter Russian aggression. It was a clear success for US President Donald Trump and for the Allies as a whole. But the further of US commitments to European security remain unclear. While the United States agreed to a communique that reaffirmed the ironclad commitment to collective defense as enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, Trump didn't say anything about the future of US force in Europe. Since Trump's inauguration in January, his administration has repeatedly stated its intention to reduce US force in Europe to strengthen American interests in the Indo Pacific and the Western Hemisphere. A significant reduction could seriously affect the distribution of allied commitments that underpin NATO's new regional defense plans. More importantly, the NATO summit was held at a time when Russia was engaged in a severe escalation in Ukraine, severely bombing Ukrainian cities with 500 drones and rockets over one night. But the summit failed to produce any significant new action against Russian President Putin aggression. Instead, the United States blocked a long planned attempt to unveil the alliance strategy against Russia at the summit. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed that the United States opposes new economic sanctions against Russia, and Trump publicly distanced himself from supporting a new tranche of security assistance to Ukraine. Moreover, in the last couple of days, Donald Trump and his administration announced that the number of air defense rockets to Ukraine will be significantly reduced or maybe stopped completely, which put Ukraine in a huge danger. The lack of US action against Russia at the Hague summit is significant. There is no clear and more direct evidence of commitment to transatlantic security than what a NATO ally does or doesn't do to support Ukraine in its relentless war against Russia. So, Trump and the Russian war. The Russia question was always going to be tricky. Most NATO countries, particularly those in close proximity to the Russian border, are in agreement that Moscow could pose a direct threat to them in the near future. Rutte himself has said Russia could use military force against the alliance within 5 years. Last year's end of summit declaration referenced in the uncertain terms Moscow's brutal war of aggression several times. But Trump has had a much softer approach to Moscow this time and has resisted treating it as an adversary. As much as it was always unlikely he was going to approve a declaration that labeled Russia as the clear culprit for the bloody Ukraine war, no more than 3 years old. So, while the statement mentions the long term threat posed by Russia to Euro Atlantic security and reaffirms the need to provide enduring support to Ukraine, there is no specific condemnation of Russia in the communique. So, will the US continue to arm Ukraine? There's a big question. Since the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, one of the main questions has been, will the US and its NATO allies arm Ukraine for successful self defense? Since the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, one of the main questions has been, will it happen? Since 2022, this issue has become crucial, mainly for Washington. Under Biden, who offered Ukraine substantial support, there was hesitancy to supply more advanced systems for a long time. The same is true under Trump, who continues to try unsuccessfully achieve lasting peace or at least a truce. This question is at the heart of Putin's strategy to establish effective political control over Ukraine, Trump's effort to achieve a solid end to the fighting, and Zelensky's attempt to preserve Ukraine as independent, secure, and economically viable state. Putin and, unfortunately, American intelligence agencies expect a quick Russian victory. Expected, but this didn't happen. First, thanks to the heroic defense of the Ukrainians, and then because of the increasingly large scale support from the West. The Kremlin has constantly complained loudly about this aid as well as Western sanctions from the first month of the invasion, but always believed that support from the United States and European allies would run out before the strength of its army. The first sign that these Kremlin calculations might prove correct appeared in the fall of 2023 when Republicans in Congress, under pressure from Trump supporters, delayed the vote on the new aid package for Ukraine. This package was approved only in April 2024, notably only after Trump himself gave his consent to Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, to put it to a vote. At that time, Trump declared that the survival of Ukraine was important to the United States. As a candidate, he promised that if he elected, he would quickly secure a stable peace based on compromises, but didn't happen. This is precisely the goal that Trump has been pursuing since returning to the White House, but he has done so without a clear strategy. His idea of compromise is that Ukraine de facto recognizes that territories under Russian control will not be returned by military means and that joining NATO is not in the immediate future. In turn, Russia must accept that Ukraine will emerge from this war as a stable and economically viable state. To make this possible, Trump has proposed sending European troops to Ukraine and providing it with serious weapons. Since February, Trump and his team have maintained regular contact with the Kremlin and Kiev, proposing numerous options for a truce. Kiev has accepted almost every one of Trump's proposals. Moscow, at the same time, has rejected all of them, except for the agreement to halt attacks on energy infrastructure, which itself broke within hours of signing. Putin does this cunningly and skillfully. He thanks Trump for his persistent effort and claims he wants peace, but he still says no and keeps bombing Ukrainian cities, killing Ukrainians on a daily basis. The reason is simple. Putin wants the war to continue because he believes that his forces, despite heavy losses, are making progress on the ground, and he will be able to leave Ukraine landlocked, economically and militarily weakened, unable to survive independently. As former Russian President Medvedev recently stated, Moscow doesn't need peace, but victory. Therefore, Putin's immediate goal is to keep fighting while also maintaining contact with Trump. Putin is doing everything he can to ensure that this disappointment in the negotiations leads the United States not to punish Russia, but to stop supplying military aid to Ukraine. If that happens, Europe will try to make up for the loss of American supplies, but that may not be enough. In that case, the goal announced by Medvedev, a Russian victory, could very well be achieved. But this outcome remains uncertain. Trump is already facing criticism even from his main supporters in the media. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Post reapproached him for allowing Putin to drag out negotiations. Concern is mounting among Republicans in Congress. Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime Trump ally, has already gathered 82 co sponsors for a major bill on sanctions against Russia. In response to criticism, Trump has repeatedly said he might impose sanctions on Moscow, but he hasn't yet taken that step. Meanwhile, some administration officials note that when signing the Mineral Resources Agreement between the United States and Ukraine, Trump approved the transfer of the last two small packages of American weapons owned by other countries. In short, Trump's policy remains indecisive. He could please Putin and halt all arms supplies to Ukraine, or he could send them through third countries or as loans, as was already done in the Minerals Agreement. This is the main issue today. Ukraine's impressive strike on advanced Russian aircraft serves as a reminder that it still possesses the will to fight and, if properly equipped, can stop Russia's further advances. Had Trump provided such capabilities, Putin might have decided it was better to agree to a ceasefire. However, Trump's response to the Ukrainian attack was mixed. He called the operation cool, but also expressed concern about escalation. Additionally, he asked Republicans in Congress not to push forward with a bill on sanctions against Russia. Some other advisors tried to use the successful Ukrainian strike to persuade Trump to stop supporting Ukraine, but Trump didn't back down. He reportedly told his staff that Putin wanted all of Ukraine. This shows that he understands Putin is the main obstacle to ending the war. So, how long Russian state can continue the war and sustain sanctions? Official analysis says Russian economy is on the brink of recession. The annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum used to be a meeting place for investors to evaluate Russia's growing opportunities against the risk of expropriation and corruption within Russian companies. But since Russia's full scale invasion of Ukraine, most investors have stopped visiting Russia, and the forum has turned into showcase for fake innovation. Even patriotic commentators compare it to the Soviet exhibition of national economic achievements. This vast exhibition center promoted the successes of an economic system that had completely collapsed by the late 1980s. Despite the artificial display of economic success, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum has developed important features, including a series of sessions in which government ministers and key experts discuss emerging economic challenges more freely than in the usual tightly censored discourse. The presence of Russian dictator Putin is another important component of the forum. The president traditionally seeks to create public resonance by incorporating memorable figures of speech into his speeches. Russian professionals who have held public office for many years have learned to express their concerns indirectly. So the official analysis boils down to the fact that the Russian economy is on the verge of recession. In fact, a clear decline is evident in most industries, with the exception of some sectors of the military industrial complex and the lack of enthusiasm for most exhibits in the vast forum was an implicit acknowledgement of this fact. According to most ministers and their economic experts, the only way to stimulate economic growth is to lower the key interest rate. Russia's central bank recently reduced its key rate to 20%, which remains more than twice the official inflation estimates. Senior Russian officials have concluded that new economic growth will require cuts in government spending and economic controls. At the core of these discussions is the idea that ending Russia's war in Ukraine is necessary for economic recovery, but Russian economists fully understand that it would be unwise to openly express such scenarios. The only Russian speaker who has convincingly reaffirmed his belief in Russia's strong economic growth, favorable investment climate, and technological leadership is Putin, whose words portray a reality that sharply contrasts with those of his loyal ministers. The only other prominent guest at the forum was Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto, who stated that Indonesia's rice and corn production has increased by 50% during his 7 month in the office. Prabowo's choice to attend the St. Petersburg Forum instead of G7 summit in Kanaskis, Canada, likely pleased Putin, especially after US President Donald Trump said Russia shouldn't be invited back to the US to the G7 anytime soon. Putin's comments about the strength of the Russian economy were not primarily aimed at the leaders of the global south or even at Ding Quanghang, the vice uh, prime minister of China, who was present at the forum. Instead, his address was directly at the leaders of NATO members gathering in The Hague. Moscow has been concerned about the NATO summit for weeks, and not just because Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky was there advocating for more support for Ukraine, supported by additional evidence of Russian sabotage of the peace deal that Donald Trump proposed. The Kremlin is more worried about the growing consensus for significant increase in European defense spending and military investment that would reshape the transatlantic relationships and prevent Russia's effort to divide NATO. Europe has already borne the majority of Ukraine's economic and military aid, and Putin's attempt to weaken its resolve by insisting on Russia's victory have been counterproductive. Putin has not yet decided whether he will try to seize Ukraine's Sumy region, but his declaration that every inch of land a Russian soldier set foot on is ours clearly signals to Europeans that they need to allocate 5% of their gross domestic product to defense. The agenda for the NATO summit has shifted due to the escalation of the Israel Iranian conflict and the US airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities, which marked a major setback for Russia's key ally in the Middle East. In the Middle East, speaking in St. Petersburg, the Russian dictator accused those who doubted Russia's reliability as a strategic partner of being provocateurs. But he also noted that Russia would offer no support to Iran beyond condemning the attacks. Putin reiterated his offer to mediate in de escalating the conflict, even though, according to Russian media, Trump had already rejected this self serving offer. So the official Kremlin website, however, doesn't show that such a conversation occurred, and the last exchange of views between the two presidents apparently happened on June 14th when Putin called to wish Trump a happy birthday. Kremlin pundits often emphasize that Trump prefers to avoid involvement in conflicts abroad and favors making deals. Now, Russian officials must see that the White House mixed messages on Iran were just a cover for the strikes on June 22. A risky US Israeli military campaign against Iran will divert attention from the war in Ukraine at the NATO summit, but it is unlikely to benefit Russia. Europeans might see this as another reason to strengthen their collective deterrence capabilities. But the primary motivation for expanded military power in Europe remains the need to counter the Russian threat. European NATO members cannot ignore the scale and seriousness of this threat, even without passionate appeals from Zelensky. Meanwhile, Putin's support for Ayatollah Khamenei's regime in Iran only confirms authoritarian Russia's relentless hostility towards Europe and Ukraine. However, Putin's failure to back a key strategic partner suggests that the danger of confrontation with Putin and Russia in total are still manageable. Western allies usually find common ground, overcoming many differences, while Russia avoids both the hardship and the benefits of diplomacy simply because it has no allies left. Thank you for listening. If you like my podcast, share it with your friends.